It's time to go inside the mega events with some of the biggest names in the trillion-dollar world of sports. Let's go beyond the scoreboard with the sports professor, Rick Horrow.
I'm the sports professor, Rick Horrow. Welcome to Beyond the Scoreboard, Inside the Mega Events. It's a trillion-dollar sports business, to be sure, and about 50 to 60% of those dollars are wrapped up in the mega events, the championships, Super Bowls, All-Star Games, World Series, Wimbledon, tennis majors, golf majors, NASCAR championships, IndyCar championships, Ryder Cup. All of those too numerous to mention. I'm in my office to kick off the show, but I'm not here a lot. I'll be on the road on a weekly basis to bring you the inside tips from those major events. The balance sheets, who wins, who loses, the interviews, how you put on the events, and how you sustain them. This is all brought to you by Edelman Financial.
Money doesn't come with instructions. That's why we created Edelman Financial Services to help you with everything from college and retirement planning to managing your investments, helping you achieve retirement security. We're among the nation's top financial advisors. Come see how we can help you.
Bowling tournaments, movies, whatever you guys got going. But I will say before I even start these remarks that kudos to Lisa and this organization. I've been around this program longer than anybody cares to know. We were just doing an interview comparing whether 25 years of history is longer than 50 years of history in different contexts. And the one thing that is consistent is that Lisa and staff put on an amazing show. And at the risk of being a little gratuitous as the closing speaker, she didn't put me up to this, there is nowhere in the country that you can get this combination of advice, hands-on, entrepreneurialism, practical, meaningful business development, lobbying. You know, there are very few conferences that will mix up lunch tables with very orderly receptions of speakers after they finish, so people don't throw resumes in their faces, to questions, to just being around. And you know, I will just tell you that Lisa and Dr. Hyman and others have, you know, your best interest at heart here, and I would commend you to take advantage of this, because I'll just tell you this, and I'm hawking this a little bit because this is my life and my legacy. It's out there, but the book is chronicling 50 years of the sports business as I define it, and as one of the oldest dudes here, I have the right to be able to tell you about how I define the history of the sports business, because, you know, if you think it's hard breaking in now, and I know you do, and with some justification, think of what it was like in 1976 when I started Harvard Law School and grew up in Miami, where we had no professional sports franchises. Not true, the Dolphins, but they were an AFL team before they were merged into the NFL. And I knew I kind of wanted to come back and get professional sports done, but I wasn't even in law school yet, and, you know, just a snot-nosed kid. How are you going to take the next step in life? So I ended up at Harvard Law trying to figure out what to do to succeed. And I realized there were some knotty problems, like I had to take corporate, I had to take tax, and I had to do numbers and all the stuff that separates you from the real world. You got to master it before you can go on and get a degree. But I had a better way. I thought, growing up in South Florida, I would write a thesis on hockey fighting and the distinction between excessive and aggressive sports violence and hockey and the criminal law, which for those of you in the Northeast, you think I'm pretty stupid. But in the 70s, when you grow up in Miami and then you see a bench-clearing brawl in the NHL, it doesn't feel right. And so I went to the Harvard Law criminal law professor and then the dean, Jim Vornberg, and asked him, would he, and everybody had to do a third-year paper, third-year thesis was a big deal, asked him whether I could pursue that as an academic discipline. And after he laughed and said, that's not law, that's sports, he also then said, well, you know, it's an interesting thought, but we don't do sports law here at Harvard, so you would be wasting your time. And those words resonate pretty clearly. The one thing that was interesting was that I got smarter because I challenged him to a bet in a game that I'd never played before, and it was squash. And I said, if you win, I'll shut up and be a normal student and take all the darn courses you want me to. And if I win, I want a hall pass at Gillette, then Schaefer Stadium, and Boston Garden and Fenway and all those places, so I could do some survey research on players who thought it was excessive versus aggressive. You're on. Practiced really hard. Two things that were really important. Oh, I know one. All right. So that forever defined the field of sports law for everybody. So, but here are two things you want to know. First, when I played the dean, he was 84 years old. Okay, Fred Spurs. Second, the person who I learned to play squash with, who was a 1L who I had just met in class, and he and I took a liking to each other. He became my roommate, but he was my squash coach, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, who was a good friend, and he and I lament that he let me loose in the field of sports law by winning that bet. I'm not suggesting to all of you, especially late in the second day of the conference, to go pick on a doddering old man and beat him in squash to define the future of the sports business. But I will suggest to you that in that world, the industry would be characterized by a number of different things. Well, first of all, 50 years ago, by the way, 30-second Super Bowl ad was 72 grand. Today it's over 5.6 million, as you know. The average ticket for the Super Bowl 50 years ago in Miami, a Super Bowl III, was $6, 6 real bucks. This year we had one in our hand, face value $3,400, and going up higher, and on and on and on. We know the industry is different, and we know it continues to evolve. But here are some characteristics that I think are really important when you think about what the industry is. First of all, back then, it was the wild, wild west. Bob Ruxin, who was a friend of mine, a Harvard Law classmate, he wrote a book called The Athlete's Guide to Agents, and it was a seminal book way back in the leather helmet days, those days, and he said, the only qualification that you have of being an agent is you have some poor schmuck who calls you an agent. Well, it's not exactly that, and it has gotten more sophisticated, but it was really the Wild West. Second, and it's gotten better, clearly, but that's one of the characteristics of the industry. Second, every aspect of sport is scrutinized. We now know that. Do you realize the LA Times did a journalistic study and found that 64% of all of the column inches today, and that includes the agate type for box scores, which is interesting, are devoted to sports news. And I'm defining, and we should all define news as deal-making, administration, law, politics, sports anthropology, sports marketing, sports administration. So it's the fact patterns applied in a little different context. We all share a common passion, which is we all understand that there's another side of sports besides the X's and O's, and who wins and who loses. And so the third characteristic, which I think is really important, is the labels of sport basically defy traditional analysis. Meaning, again, you can have a fact pattern and it is sports law. I know there are legal issues to it, but it's also sports marketing, sports administration, and sports politics, public-private partnerships, and sports business. So as a result, the idea of coming up with a discipline today is one that crosses a whole bunch of different studies. What sports business is at one school is sports administration in another. We never get hung up on labels. I never do, and I don't think anybody ever will in the future. That's a unique characteristic of the sports business. And finally, the sports industry itself is defined by changing circumstances. For example, PricewaterhouseCoopers just came out with a survey of media rights, and they said that by 2022, survey of the industry, they said by 2022, media rights would be $24 billion total in the U.S. Sponsorship up about 4%, licensing up 4.5%, tickets up 2.2%. What's the biggest increase in the sports business broadly defined? Philanthropy. $12 billion, it's up 28%. And so who would have thought 5 years ago that sports philanthropy, and of course, Dr. Narati's program is way ahead, you already have a lot of that here, would have focused on sports philanthropy, but it clearly does. And so the idea is to take advantage of these changing circumstances by finding an opportunity and kind of bursting down the door. I was lucky enough to put the Miami Arena together when I returned back from law school in the early mid-'80s, get the expansion Miami Heat done, went to NASCAR and saw a race, and interestingly enough was called by Bill France and said, you know, what do you know about racing? And I said, well, I know everything there is to know or need to know, that cars go around the track and they finish. And oh, by the way, more important than that, I was just walking around your parking lot and you have all cars from all 50 states here, which means people are driving in and spending money, and let's do an economic impact study and compare the Super Bowl economic impact to what you do twice a year here in Daytona, and see if we can use that as leverage for public money. So Kansas and Chicago and some of those racetracks later, that was something that did. I didn't know anything about racing, but it's kind of creating those opportunities. Jack Nicklaus then called me and said, we'd like to kind of help get into the business of being the next IMG. Jack wanted to get all the benefits and not necessarily do all the work. And I was right there defining for him how to talk about the new sports business. He never really rose to the level of an IMG, but clearly he said, he obviously was represented by them, but clearly he said, you know, I want somebody that's pretty flexible on stuff. Ended up selling my business and putting together sports media stuff. I trademarked the name The Sports Professor. The only people that don't like that name, by the way, are sports professors, because I try to explain sports to the general audience and, you know, do it on Fox and Bloomberg and NBC and otherwise. And it's interesting. If you talk about sports news, everybody understands it. Talk about sports business, your eyes glaze over. Same facts, same issues, same stuff. It's a question of perception. So I guess what I'm trying to say, long-winded, is be diverse, show some consistency, and break in based on very, very specific, intense commitments with opportunities that exist. So the good news and the bad news is this. The good news is that the field is structured. We were just talking about how many programs there are. It's a good way to end today. I counted 497 programs at colleges and universities, graduate level, undergraduate, that have sport in their title, programs and classes. And that means that if you want to learn the business, simply, you find one of those programs, you see what city you're in, and you pick it. Pretty easy. The other side of it is there are 40 trillion people who claim to be qualified sports people who are passionate about the game, want to get in, and want to fill those seats. So what does that mean? It means that you've got to be more creative and more entrepreneurial than ever before. It's interesting because when we put together the Sport Business Handbook, and Paul Tagliabue, Gary Bettman, Don Garber, Don Shula, Jack Nicklaus, Gary Player, whole host of successful entrepreneurs came together and wrote their chapters on what it takes to be viable in the sports business and succeed, which is absolutely the same advice on what it is to break into the business. And just to give you some name highlights of words that continue to appear without explanations because it's pretty obvious. There were 10 of them. Define imagination as reality, meaning vision. Be flexible enough in your circumstances. That's a Nicklaus comment. His comment was, always do the same thing a certain way unless you don't. Kind of a cool thing to hear from him. Be consistent with your tenacity getting off the sidelines. Finding the positives in the negatives. You hear a lot of this in motivational speaking, but maybe you don't hear this from a group of common, interested, successful entrepreneur athletes who are also striving toward the same goals. Use leverage as best you can, providing credibility when you can. Nicholas came up with something called the 7-minute rule, which is, I'd say it's probably too long. But he said if you're in a conversation and you can't convince somebody of something in 7 minutes, it's over. People's attention span are much less. We had a discussion today with some scholars from the middle of Virginia who said maybe it's 17 minutes, not 7. I think it's probably more closer to 7, maybe. That's the issue there. But the bottom line of it is you've got to be consistent and you've got to say exactly what's on your mind. Find the positives in the negatives. Finesse the powerful ego, which is one issue. 5 of our key contributors, including 2 commissioners, said the most important issue for them, is ego management. And I think that's more psychological than it is business-wise, but it's all interrelated. And so it's not just following the 10 steps and being done. It's saying these are characteristics that are proven business principles. Let's apply them to sport. Let's get in and be involved. And let's see how we can disrupt and ruffle the industry. Having said that, where's the industry going? Well, you got to be global. You've got to be aware that it's no longer in a playpen. It's only defined by geographical borders. Sport is worldwide, and as soon and as many times as people can recognize that, the better. Second, it's not your father's media. I have situations in my life where I'll give graduation presents to folks and offer them big TVs. They don't want big TVs, they want small phones. They don't want to see anything on television. They want to see something where they can start and download. Everybody understands that now. The third piece of this is the notion of vertical integration. If I am an expert at something in the sports business, I need to also be familiar enough with other aspects of the sports business so I can put it all in context. Meaning, if I am a salesperson, I know a little bit about facility development. I ought to know a little bit about media rights. I ought to know a little bit about collective bargaining. I know it's difficult, and I know there are a lot of pressures on it, but that's the way of the world. And that's one of the reasons why there's so many people who are interested in doing exactly this. And my final comment, which I think is really, really important, then I want to hear from you guys. I want to hear from you before I let you go for some questions. The final comment I would make is you have an opportunity to do something that no one's ever done before. Meaning, we all understand why we want to be in the sports business, that Sunday night is over. God, thank God the weekend's over. Now I get back to work. We all understand how passionate we can be about the sports business and how it's something that other people don't do. Notwithstanding the fact that everybody in the world wants to get in it, you all have the tenacity, obviously, or you wouldn't be here, the intelligence, or you wouldn't be here, and the circumstance to be able to survive and thrive in the sports business. Why? Because you have great training, you have great entrepreneurial experience, you have some intensity, but you also, I think and hope, are pretty darn realistic that it's not going to happen overnight. And if you have to take a $15,000 intro, man, that's a lot of money. No, if you have to take some significant cut in salary relative to what others who have graduated a similar program are doing to get into sports, you better do it. It's not for the weak of heart. It's for people who are fully committed to this business. And the final bit of good news, therefore, is if you're able to put this all together, and if you're able to survive and thrive with doing some hard work early, not only can you get a position in the sports business, but the sports, entertainment, and recreational business is so much more powerful and rich and fundamentally different than it ever has been before. 5 years from now, Lisa and I were talking, we don't know what the business is going to be like, but it's going to be better than it is today. And 10 years from now, it's going to be much better than it is 5 years from now. The point is, you all are well positioned. well-trained, well-educated, and obviously the sky's the limit. I guarantee you, you're not going to have to sit there and find some 82-year-old to beat in squash to get into the sports business. Listen, thank you all very much for this, and I really appreciate the opportunity to bat cleanup today.
Thank you.
Any questions, or are we 1 minute away from a final blessing from Lisa?
Well, I'd welcome